Welcome to today's Tuesday talk on Cognition in a Time of Climate Crisis, Thinking Automatically, Deliberately and with Meta-Awareness by Malika Virah-Sawmy. Malika has been working for the past 20 years across all continents in sustainability topics, including particular agriculture, adaptation to climate change, and natural resource management. She has been working not only as a researcher, but as a facilitator as well in various capacities. She is the co-founder of the Sensemakers Collective, which works on global transformation processes by applying system thinking and generative coaching to support different organizations. In addition, she is also a research associate at Humboldt University and has been recently appointed co-chair of the Task Force on Palm Oil by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. We are very happy to have Malika as a fellow here for the coming year, and I look forward to her presentation now. Just as a quick reminder, as always, we are recording this session. And now, Malika, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Achim, and thanks. Yes, I'll start the presentation. Maybe I think one important thing that in a way that I'd like to start with, if you want to know me, I spend a lot of time sitting under trees. And I will share you a quote about me sitting under trees. So today what I will talk about, can you see the screen? Yeah, good. I will talk about cognition in a time of crisis. And I will not just speak, it's very interactive because I would like to collect data. I would like to have your feedback as well. I'm still, how do you say that? I'm also still shaping my fellowship. So this is part of, hearing your wisdom and and to help me shape what I'm going to do. I'm very lucky to be with the IASS for a year. So I just started. And I wanted to start with this quote. So I work with a deep adaptation on the possibility or the likelihood of collapse. And this is a quote that I found on the internet that has been tweeted around by the Climate Psychologists Alliance. And I will just let you read about it because it situates the talk I want to have today about expanded cognition. So the way the talk will be today is I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about cognition. And I will talk why limited cognition reinforces the planetary crisis. We're going to have a quick reflection and discussion based on the data that I will share with you. And then I'm going to talk why we need expanded cognition to work on the planetary crisis, and share with you some practices and policy-making tools on expanded cognition. And then we're going to have another reflection and discussion. So as I mentioned, I would like not to only hear my voice. So if cognition was a compass for knowing, and a compass takes us from north to east to south and west, what's our faculty for cognition right now? And this is work based on Daniel Kahneman's work, which shows that most of us are using thinking fast and thinking slow. So thinking slow is deliberate cognition. So most of your work as a scientist is thinking slow. So it's thought-based, it's effortful, it's rule-governed, it's slow. There is also automatic cognition, thinking fast. So that's more what we call gut reaction, effortless, reactive, fast. So thinking fast works very well when we have to make simple decisions. For example, when we are told to taste different jams and feel the preferences we have for the jam, just thinking fast, just the gut reaction after tasting 5 jams works pretty well to get an idea of what is the quality of the jam, what's our preferences. So that works well. When it comes to complex issues, traditionally we have thought that thinking slow, so analytical work is what would help with complex issues. And that's what I will challenge right now in this talk. So before I start, I will talk about, we're going to revisit what's expanded cognition. And I don't know how many of you have practices for expanded cognition, but if you don't have practices, those words that I have written might sound like esoteric like bullshit. And it's only when we have practices around that can we really know what I'm talking about in terms of expanded cognition. So I think of the north as heart-centered thinking, so thinking with the body. East as full presence sensing, so feeling the awareness around us. South, full-bodied feeling, so knowing from a place of the body. And deep imagining. And to start with, I'm going to go into a little exploration with you. So, and why limited cognition reinforces the planetary crisis. But in this one, we're gonna go away from limited cognition. I'm going to take, first I realized the slide. I forgot the structure of the talk. So what makes climate change so challenging? So firstly, it's faceless and invisible. And by faceless and invisible, what I mean is that it's very difficult to attribute its cause to a particular agent. And unlike other crises where we can, like if you look at mining or wars or nuclear or deforestation, there is an agent, you can put a face to it. But with climate change, it's almost like for me, how I experience it is like a faceless omnipresence. And this is a costume I'm designing on what climate change means. And it's also invisible because its effect is not seen until these planetary processes are affected. And even when there is planetary processes affected, not everyone can see are experiencing this. So it's to me, it feels very faceless and invisible. And because of that, it feels very scary. Also, I think all of you are aware how climate change is complex. Its effect affects life through complex cause and effect. That's very intangible for many to understand, to imagine. But it's also complex because it's very difficult. It's socially complex to deal with. And it's socially complex to deal with because climate change is going to affect us in very different ways, whether different countries, different economic classes and sectors. And this heterogeneity creates an additional complication for us because actors have different incentives, risk and resources and capacity to act. It's also complex because it requires us to think long-term rather than short-term. And we know humans have huge difficulties to think long-term, to respond adequately long-term. And climate change is also fraught with uncertainty over thresholds. And we're going to be I'm going to show you the results around uncertainty in a bit. So to start with, I wanted to take you on a journey around what's uncertainty. And I'm going to explore uncertainty from a place what I call full-bodied feeling and deep imagining. So if you feel comfortable, imagine yourself on this boat. So you can just relax right now because we're going to go on a journey exploring what's uncertainty. Imagine yourself on that boat. You're having to leave the land you come from. Resources are far too scarce for the size of the present human population where you live. Wars have been raging for a long time because of scarce food resources. The rainfall patterns have become so unpredictable that it's almost impossible to grow any food. And the soil is also very eroded, and there's not much wildlife and fishing resources left. As people have exploited, you have exploited everything as agriculture has failed. People on that island know that there are only two choices: to live and face uncertainty over the future, or fight and control the scarce resources. You have made a choice. You have decided to live and face uncertainty. So I invite you to just, if you feel comfortable, to just close your eyes and imagine yourself on that boat. Now that you've accepted uncertainty by taking that boat, how does uncertainty feel like to you? How do you look at the voyage? And lastly, how do you look at the choice you decided not to make, that is to control scarce resources? How do you look at that choice you decided not to make? To control, not to control scarce resources. So I invite you to come back. Just make a mental note of what are the feelings you have felt, how you look at the voyage internally, and we're going to go back to this hopefully in the reflection and discussion later on. So how do we face uncertainty? So right now I took you on a voyage of looking at uncertainty from a place of choice and of hopefully expanded cognition. But how do we usually face uncertainty under limited cognition? So limited cognition is, as I mentioned, thinking fast, or thinking analytically, thinking deliberately, which is thinking slow. So another thing about me is I love games, and I love science where they use games to explore our psychology. And there are really interesting results, which this talk forms part of a paper that I'm about to submit, looking at climate, using games to understand our psychological barriers with climate change. So in this game, it's a collective risk game. There are 4 treatments. In the first treatment, there were 400 players, and players had to negotiate to avoid catastrophic climate change under 4 different circumstances. In the first circumstances, there was certainty over what would be the impacts and where the dangerous threshold was, okay? In the second sample, there was impact uncertainty. So they knew where the threshold was, but they didn't know what the impact would be, okay? In the third one, they knew what the impacts would be, but they didn't know where the threshold was. And in the last one, they didn't know what the impact would be, and they didn't know what would be the threshold. What's really interesting about the result is several things. One is that there was more success in collaborating when there was certainty over thresholds than uncertainty over impacts. Let me explain that. Let me explain that later. But where groups just couldn't cooperate was when there were threshold uncertainty. As soon as we didn't know what the threshold was, the whole cooperation didn't work. And when there was impact uncertainty and threshold uncertainty, again, it was impossible to collaborate. But what's interesting with that is that we can deal with, in those two, there was more success when there was impact uncertainty rather than certainty. So this is, for me, what is really interesting is that as soon as we don't know what the threshold is going to be, it's almost impossible for groups to cooperate under climate change. And in that game, they also had to make pledges. And as you see, when there's certainty where the threshold is and where the impact will be, the players behave very similarly. They make similar pledges. But again, when they know where the threshold is, but they don't know what the impact is, they still collaborated a lot. And that's really interesting. So even though they don't know what the impacts would be, but they know where the threshold would be, they are behaving in similar ways. But as you see, as soon as we don't know where the threshold is, we behave in very different ways. And this is even amplified when there is impact and threshold uncertainty. So my questions to you, again, make a mental note or write it in your in a piece of paper you have. What do you think explains the results under threshold and impact uncertainty? And it doesn't mean I don't have the answers, and I think the paper doesn't even come up with the answers. So it's not as if I'm asking you this question just to test you, but I want to know how you see the results, what you think are the reasons for the results. So the next challenge about climate change is how do we face inequity under limited cognition. And in this one, I won't go on an exploration of expanded cognition, because for me, inequity is a very deeply emotional journey. So I'm going to show you how we face inequity under limited cognition. So again, I look at collective risk games. And in this collective risk game, there were 4 treatments. And again, this collective risk game is specifically using climate change. It's looking at how what happens with inequality to avoid disastrous climate change. So it's been used particularly for understanding how we can work on climate change. And there is a lot of work done on inequity outside of climate change sphere, of course. And so in the base treatments, they all started with very similar amount of money. So it was a equitable distribution of resources. And they were told in the experiment when in the game they could pledge. And then in the next treatment, the base unequal, they started with very different resources. So there was a very poor, and the very rich. And again, in the base treatment, they were not told when they could pledge. So they had to come up themselves, okay, I pledge for commitment. And in the pledge treatment. They were told when in the game they could pledge. So that was after 3 rounds and after 7 rounds, they knew that something would come. So the results show very clearly in terms of inequality. So the blue is, were they successful in avoiding dangerous climate change? So when we start with pretty equal conditions, we are more likely, so half of the group were, 5 out of 10 were able to avoid disastrous climate change. Whereas when we start with unequal conditions, 2 out of 10, this was played in several rounds, could avoid dangerous climate change. Now, what's interesting with the pledges is that when they knew when it was going to happen, that increased the likelihood of cooperating over avoidance of dangerous climate change. Then they started to communicate better when it didn't require only on them taking personal action. When they knew in the game when it would happen. And again, you see the same thing in the case of unequal. And so that's why the paper is about inequality, but also communication. So the pledge was testing, like when you knew something was happening, how would the communication be? What's really interesting also about the game, in successful groups, the burden share, because basically they had to invest to avoid dangerous climate change. That was what they had to do during the game. And I forgot to say, in the other game they also had, it's also about investing to avoid dangerous climate change. So it's also, the games look at how we share our resources, how we invest. And in this, the burden share between poor and, in successful groups, the burden share between the poor and the rich are equal. So the poor shares equally. But in failing groups, the poor shares more than the rich. It's really interesting. Although in this game, like the impacts, like it didn't assume that the poor would be more affected. So again, the question is, what explains the results under inequality and what are called planned pledges? So I'll stop sharing my screen. I wanted a short discussion of responses and reactions, and I will collect your feedback to what I have spoken so far, and what do you think explains the results under impact and threshold uncertainty, and under inequity and the possibility or lack of possibility of communication. So if anyone wants to give me feedback, but also the feedback of how you journeyed when you knew uncertainty, when you made a choice for uncertainty. So any reaction, responses? Mark, I see your hand is up. And then Ilan, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Malika, for that little journey. I have a very, very simple answer to that. It feels like working at the IASS. Getting on that ship felt like the uncertainty that we have all faced for the last 10 years. And every time we think we see an island ahead of us, it turns out to be a mirage, and we try to find a way in a different direction and so on. And it feels like the journey at the ISS, though, in a different way, because instead of taking our safe jobs, many of us actually left relatively safe jobs. I had a permanent position at a Max Planck Institute as a group leader researcher, sort of a holy grail for scientists, and left that kind of safe job working against scarce resources, but that safe job to take the journey in the ISS. And many, many other people have done that as well at the ISS. And it reflects it in two ways. We're trying to find some special safer shores, or not just safer shores for us, but we're actually trying to find a sort of a passage to India, so to speak, a passage to the new world. We're trying to find a way to connect together the current situation of the world with somewhere where there might be better ways of living and better resources for those that we have, quote unquote, left behind in our journey through transdisciplinarity. So I find it really a very nice analogy. And I know a few people have been thinking of ocean type analogies for the ISS. So In any case, thank you very much for that little shared exercise. For the other part, I'll hand it over to others to give you some explanations as to why they think that some of these results might come up.
Thanks, Mark.
We have seen Ilan and Pierre has risen their hands or so. So perhaps Ilan next and then Pierre.
First, in terms of the journey, I have immediately the reaction, partly from my own history, that, oh, good. If I go on a journey, who knows what might show up? And that's exciting. So I'm a bit addicted to adventures in that sense. Though I also understand, obviously, the risk in that, but a considered risk. What I wanted to comment on is this very interesting set of results on the impact versus threshold choices. And one of the thoughts, at least a conjecture on my part, would be that if you know that there is some impact, but you don't know what it is, one may have a greater sense of agency, of ability to cope with that. Whereas if the threshold is unknown, you don't know how large a problem you're going to face, nor when you will face it. And that's more difficult. That's at least my, sort of first take on it. In this situation. Let me turn it over to my friend and colleague and co-conspirator, Pierre Glynn in Washington also.
I really enjoyed your talk, Malika. And so I guess the first question I think you asked is you asked us to close our eyes and think about, having made a choice and going on some voyage which had quite a bit of uncertainty. And I guess, my reaction to that is, as soon as, presumably we had the uncertainty before of the issue, whatever it was, before making that choice. As soon as we make a choice, we effectively, reduce uncertainty simply by making the choice. So, I think there's a psychological feedback there that, we reduce our feeling of uncertainty. Whether we made the choice, whether that choice was good or not is irrelevant, really. But we just by making choices, by making decisions, we reduce our feelings of uncertainty, okay? Whether we make our world more complex or not, and therefore perhaps more uncertain or not, is a separate question. Okay, then the other example that you gave, I didn't quite understand Ilan's answer, but it might be, my answer might be similar. Essentially, when there was impact uncertainty, people were able to agree a lot more. When there was threshold uncertainty, people, there was very little agreement or cooperation. And yes, it was surprising in a way. When there was certainty, there was quite a bit of cooperation, but not as much as when there was impact uncertainty. I think that when there's impact uncertainty, we don't necessarily have well defined stakes, right? So we're all kind of playing games of one sort or another. And when there's really uncertainty about impacts, those stakes have not really been identified. If there's threshold uncertainty, that assumes presumably that impacts have been identified, and now we're talking, and so the stakes of the game have been identified, but now we don't know exactly at what thresholds they will come into being. And so there, my feeling is that because the stakes have been identified, you know, it's you know, different constituencies, different actors, you know, have stakes, and they're motivated to you know, much more to do things for their own benefit because now they perceive the stakes better, and maybe they don't, you know, it's harder to cooperate. And the last example, I'll be honest, I you know, I wasn't able to follow enough to be able to give you an answer.
Okay, thanks. Juliane Völkers also wanted to react, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree with Pierre. And just to stick with the metaphor, I was thinking that the impact, I guess, is kind of the journey and what kind of boat do we need? What kind of crew do we need? Whereas the threshold is setting off, like taking action. Like this is the day or the time where we actually embark on this journey. And this is something similar to I make the decision to do something, and that gives me agency. I'm somewhat empowered, at least that's what my feedback system tells me. So there's this like small step that we can cognitively tackle, like irrelevant how long, how far, and how difficult this journey is going to be. At that point where I can say, I do this, how well, I guess I'll meet people on the way. I find ways to do things. And then it's all like my project and my experiences. And this is, I think, also maybe with the inequity topic. So I'm guessing a little. I don't really know, but I'm guessing is that richer people are like, I've got my resources. I feel good. I do not really feel the need to do this journey. Whereas poorer people, maybe they also say it's okay to leave things behind. I'll find something new. I do something new. I don't know if others may have different opinions on that, but that is at least an idea that I would like to contribute here.
And then now, I think Barbara, I don't know how many responses you want to collect, Malika, but perhaps at least Barbara, and then see how much more comes. Please, Barbara.
Thanks, and thanks, Malika, for taking us on this great thought experiment journey. A lot has been said already on the examples, and many of the thoughts that I had in mind already came up. But one thing that I wanted to add to the example acting under uncertainty is also referring to what Juliane just said. Maybe it's also a matter of the resources that someone has available or capacities in the question of when to decide to take action. If it's clear that there's going to be an impact, and even though I don't know how high it is, but it's clear I will be impacted, then I may be inclined to act, not really thinking about what kind of resources I have. But if there is the question of a threshold and the question of, so when should I start to act, then maybe I think more about, do I have the resources? Is it economically feasible? Do I have the capacities now, or could I put it sort of on the, and we say auf die lange Bank schieben in German, so like wait for it for a better point in the future when I want to take action. That was a thought that I had, that maybe this point also comes into play. And then on the first example, on that journey, I felt a bit like this thought experiment by John Rawls, the wheel of ignorance, and so how do we build social contracts? Not that there is much in common, but the question I had is, how much do I really know when I embark on this experiment, and how much and what kind of decision do I make then? And then I thought it's probably that matters very much, how much I know and what kind of knowledge I come with, whether I go happily on that journey, as Ilan said, or going on a journey that's exciting, and even if it's uncertain, I'm looking forward to it. But if I make that decision out of despair because all my livelihood is sort of scratched and I have to leave the place, then maybe I go with a different feeling. Then it's not like I'm really looking forward to that uncertain journey, but I just do it. Or yes, so that's probably could be very different motivations and also very different feelings, and that people have when they go into the journey. So I hope I could, yes, get my thoughts across. Thanks.
And then probably Erika, and then we continue with the presentation. Is that the idea? Okay, then Erika, please.
Okay, I will keep it short. I just had one comment on the like being able to cooperate when you do or do not know the thresholds. And to me, it would seem that if you don't know when and if something's going to happen, it's just much easier to distance yourself from it, right? To just say like, well, yeah, these are the possible impacts, but I might be dead then, or they might never happen because maybe something else will change. That means we never reach that threshold, right? And so because of that, I can see that it's much harder to get people to do anything because you're dealing with an uncertainty of if something will even happen, right? Because there will always be somebody who can say, yeah, but we don't know when the threshold is and we don't even know if we'll reach it. And so I just think for me, that's like one of the things that immediately came to mind with that like uncertainty about thresholds, which I think is also very relevant in the climate case.
Thanks. Oh, Pierre, and then I continue.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think in the last example that you gave, you know, I think that this is something I definitely want to dig into that paper more. But you know, this issue of rich versus poor really looks at material. You know, I'm guessing looks at material resources, yeah, and doesn't really look at well-being or values, maybe more generally, right? And so. So for example, there are other things that might come in, like whether somebody has, you know, really has a strong feeling of community, of being part of a, you know, a family, and those feelings of community and family, you know, maybe contribute to their well-being, right? And so, you know, when we think about values, human values and what we value, sure, material resources is one way to think about value, but it's not the only way to think about value.
Thanks, Pierre. Thanks. Yes, so maybe I will start with, I'll start with uncertainty, and then I will comment on inequality and pick up on Pierre's point also, you know, like, and firstly, I hope I can make myself, how do you say that? I'm trying to pick on different thoughts that have been shared. And I do think I'm picking out what Erika has shared. I do think indeed when the threshold is not known, we distance ourselves. And what happens when we distance ourselves is that we react, we make decisions, false decisions based on automatic responses, you know, because we cannot imagine something we don't know, then self-interest comes in, you know, where just the self-interest comes in. Although in both games, participants were told that there will be a dangerous threshold of climate change. So they were made aware of that something dangerous, that invisible, faceless, you know, presence was there, but still they distanced them. As soon as threshold was there, it appears. The experiment doesn't explain what happens. They say that the only in the first experiment on uncertainty, they explain it in terms of fears. They said fear of when they knew that where the threshold was, the fear of crossing that threshold is what led them to collaborate. But I think that many other things are happening. And I think that we underestimate the stress that we feel under uncertainty. And when there is stress, we tend to dissociate ourselves. And when we dissociate ourselves, we only focus on the I, what is my, like what's my advantage in all that? I'm just, protecting. In fact, if in fact my hypothesis is that as soon as they know there is a dangerous something that can happen, but they don't know how it's going to play out, it actually brings much more fear in the system. So there's much more stress in the system. And as soon as there is stress in the system, we think fast, we think for ourselves, we're just trying to, so we have, how do you say that? We have the opposite of the conditions for cooperation. And what else did I want to explain? So, and then what happens is that, as Erika mentioned, we dissociated ourselves, and then you see what you get right now in the world: denial of climate change, mistrust, and reinforcing your own worldview. And that's a fear response, because the omnipresent climate change is there in the subconscious, in the unconscious, subconscious, or whatever, and the stress that they feel with that uncertainty makes like those biases that we have even stronger. And I think often I feel that in the dialogue that we have on climate change, we underestimate what's happening in people's unconscious, subconscious with threshold uncertainty, because we have to admit we have threshold uncertainty right now, and we underestimate the emotional impact of that. Where I cannot explain it is inequality, okay? I think, who mentioned that I think that the richer you are, the more likely you want to protect your resources, the less likely you're going to invest. I think it would have been interesting to test that under different impact and threshold uncertainty, whether their responses change. I assume that, like given conditions of, if you starting conditions are good, you tend to hold on to your asset. What else would I say about that? I think under limited cognition, and Pierre, you mentioned, like that other qualities, such as, to what extent community was, the feeling of other richness we have was not measured. What's interesting with collective risk game is that you put any people under certain conditions, and you see what happens. And what's interesting with those games is that given conditions, whether, like given a set of conditions, we tend to behave all more or less similar. And that's, like that's, I found that a little bit fascinating, how in risk games, in game theory, it's about putting people under the conditions. It's the conditions that determines the outcomes rather than other aspect. So I'll continue a little bit my talk. So as I mentioned, that I believe that the only way that we are going to be able to work on planetary crisis if we have expanded cognition. And I'm going to show you a simple result of another game, which shows which shows how it changes outcomes. In this case, it was not done in the context of climate change. So I don't know if you know the trust game. The trust game is a game played in game theory in which there are two players and they exchange money. And when you exchange money, there is an experimenter who triples the amount when you exchange money. So if I give you $5, then you will get, not I, but you get $15. And the same when you exchange with me. So in this experiment, there were black and white players, and they were playing the trust game. And there were 3 controls. One is a simple exercise, which didn't even take more than 10 minutes, of taking people to a mindful places. So if you're not familiar with what mindfulness is an approach where you know, like, it can be, you can use breathing approaches. It's just you simply become aware what's happening in you and around you. You become more aware. Often we're not so aware. So that was just a simple experiment where you just, you know, like, you're guided to become just more aware what's happening inside and outside of you at the beginning of the game, okay? And this was not implemented during the game. When the players had a mindfulness experience at the beginning of the game for 5 minutes, the likelihood that they gave to Black partners was much more. So in this one, in the control, they gave it's measuring to what extent they gave more to white players or Black players in the trust game. So in the control, they gave much more to white players than to Black players. In the control attention, so it's just to focus people. I don't know what exactly they did, but they wanted to have some kind of attention control sample. Again, the same results, even worse than the pure control. But in mindfulness, players, the total amount given to white players and Black players. So they just gave more. They gave what the discrepancy between how much they gave to white players versus Black players was much more reduced. I mean, they still gave more to white players, but it's much more reduced than what you see here. Okay. And that's a simple mindfulness experiment. So that simple experiment, there are not a lot of experiments. Most of the benefits of expanded cognition has been done on personal benefits. You know, it reduces our stress level, it allows us to concentrate more, it gives us more empathy. Very few experiments, and if you know more experiment, I'd love if you could share it with me, that has been done. What happens to the collective when we have practices. So this is one experiment that I found super interesting when you apply that in the context of how do we make decisions, how do we trust, how do we share after a mindful experience, especially in the divide either between poor and rich or Black or white. And so given everything that I have spoken right now, to me, it seems really evident, at least from a place of inner knowing, that we will not be able to tackle planetary crisis unless we have expanded cognition. We're making decisions from a place of expanded cognition. And again, for those who are not familiar what expanded cognition is practices like mindfulness, practices like deep listening. Deep listening means that we are listening not from a place of judgment, but we're listening from a place of keeping the facts, but also from a place of compassion. So feeling what the person, having a sense of what the person is feeling and what's trying to emerge. And that's the same with deep relating. And in a paper that I have written, I think we see a lot of, we know in the last 30 years of, especially with mindfulness experiments, that we know how the benefits of mindfulness. What's really interesting, I find, and this is how I would like to finish this talk, is that this expanded cognition is now being embedded in decision making. And I find that probably the most exciting aspect right now. I'm just aware of time. What's the time, Achim?
We have still some 10 minutes left, so. Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to finish with 3 very exciting expanded cognition embedded in policymaking. As an inspiration, as many of you are working on policymaking as well. to have a little bit of an idea of how excitingly this is becoming embedded in policymaking. I will start with the precautionary principle because actually it's a German, it started in Germany. So the precautionary principle was developed in the 1970s in Germany, Vorsorgeprinzip, and it was used to adopt a clean act banning use of certain substances that was suspected in causing environmental damage, even though the evidence at the time of their impact was inconclusive. And what was really revolutionary at that time is that the policymakers knew that there was inconclusive evidence, but they felt that, you know, under such circumstances, we take a precautionary principle. And since then, the precautionary principle has been applied in other policymaking tools, in the Rio Declaration, in the EU Commission right now. But what's really important, I've been reflecting on the precautionary principle. So under limited cognition, precautionary principle will not work, you know, because we're going to have the same gut reaction. We're going to try to think, if there is uncertainty around thresholds or uncertainty around, coupled with uncertainty of impacts, it's impossible for the precautionary principle to work. But if we use it with more expanded cognition, I believe that we are more likely to be able to use the precautionary principle. So when people say the precautionary principle has failed, I think it has failed because we're using a limited cognition. We're using it under limited cognition. And for some reason, and if anyone knows a story of the precautionary principle in Germany, I would love to know the circumstances in which it was developed and was able to be implemented and developed in Germany. I'd love to understand that context. The next one that I'd like to talk is the Commission for Future Generation. And I think most of you probably know there is a Native American principles that believes that you make decision, especially important community decision, the impact of any decision must be considered in the context of the next 7th generation. So that's called the 7th generation principles to protect future generations, as well as future lives, non-human lives as well. And in the Wales were very brave to create a commission for future generations and embed that kind of thinking in how they made policies. And I've spoken to some of the government people in Wales, so they don't only have that institutional setting, they also have practices, expanded cognition practices to really implement what they try to do by institutionalizing this beautiful 7th generation principle. So I think this is a very exciting new possibilities that is happening in governments right now. And right now, Scotland is also looking at what Wales are doing, and New Zealand is also learning from Wales. Maybe why not Germany? And the last one that I wanted to speak is the Wanganui River Claims Settlement Act. So one very interesting thing when you start having access to more expanded cognition is that you start seeing yourself not only as a physical individual, but you start sensing yourself as part of a body, yeah, but also as part of a social body and the earth body. So you're not, your cognition is not only on the I as the individual, but you start seeing yourself as part of these different systems. And this is not only cognitive, but it's a sense that you start having known as interbeing. So you're not seeing also as just as a isolated being, but you start feeling that sense of interbeing. That term was coined by the Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk. And what's really interesting with that sense when you have expanded cognition is that many indigenous communities had that sense of interbeing. So the Maori, for example, people, they believe that the river is indivisible from them. And this New River claims is based on this Maori principle that we have to make decisions based on interbeing because we are part of this system. And since it came into force in 2017 in New Zealand, and since then India and other countries are trying to also enforce copy that issue. What's really important, what I want to say, is not just an institutional policy making. It encourages us to make decisions from a place of expanded cognition, and that's so it's right now where we are in the world. It's very difficult to wait for everybody to reach a threshold of expanded cognition. But I believe the more we have these policy-making tools that are embedding these principles, these possibilities for expanded cognition, the more likely we're going to accelerate the access to expanded cognition to decision makers, etc. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. It is almost 3 p.m., but I think we would have time for one quick comment or question or so, if somebody has one. I see Mark, please.
If nobody else does, then I'll throw in a quick double comment to you. So Malika, thank you very much for those insights. It's really wonderful, and it's nicely ties together a lot of threads of work that we do at the Institute, which you'll learn about over time. And I know your buddy Caroline has certainly been introducing you to a number of people. There's two that I'd like to suggest in that context. First off, the precautionary principle is one that runs its threads through, of course, a lot of work at the Institute. One person whom you might want to talk with about that is Stefan Schaefer, who has been quite interested in this in the context of the governance of the complex topic of climate geoengineering. And he and I and many others have looked at the precautionary principle in that context over the years. And the other is, you mentioned the Commission on Future Generations. It might please you to know that we had Mike Palmer, who was one of the very active people in that as a fellow at the Institute. And the last in-person event we had the week before the lockdowns was a workshop together with Jane Davidson, who was the commissioner who actually brought this into play, and Barbara Adam that Mike Palmer organized. And so, and there were a lot of connections within the Institute established to that as well. So, which unfortunately we were limited on following up on due to the pandemic coming about. But again, these are people that may be interesting context for you, and sort of in the vein of the IASS in you're working with us.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. And it's now exactly 3 p.m. So there's unfortunately not much time left or so for further questions. But as mentioned at the beginning, Malika will stay with us for an entire year. You can find her contact details on our website. So please feel free to come up with questions, comments, and other things in the next days or weeks or whenever you like it. Having said that, thank you very much, Malika, again for the presentation and also for the journey you took us with. And for all others, I wish you all a happy day, a nice warm day, and see you around one way or the other. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Malika. Super inspiring. Be well.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks.